Now let's talk a little about Darwinism, because Darwin's ideas went on to have an enormous impact on the scientific world and so forth. And so Darwinism is going to have a long, long road to travel down to the present in the past 140 or so years. And so Darwinism is going to go through a lot of changes. It's going to create great social upheavals in culture and so forth and so on. And like I said, even, create debates that come down to this very moment in time. So any major movement like this and any epic change will engender multiple adaptations, multiple schools of interpretation. And Darwinism is much larger now than Darwin's ideas themselves. I mean, of course, he's the originator of the ideas, but now there have been multiple different views that have branched out. But each manifestation does, endeavor to somehow or another build out or build upon what he started. From around 1920 to 1950, Darwinism is going to start to gel into something that's referred to today as the modern synthesis. The idea here is that every discipline in the sciences is going to integrate their efforts around Darwinism by accepting the Darwinian revolution and the Darwinian interpretation of the natural world. So this is going to become the great assumption within the American all universities. Okay, it starts in the sciences. Eventually, it will break out of the bounds of the sciences even into the humanities, as we discussed before, so that even in the humanities, Darwinian ideas are accepted as the organizing principle. In 1953, DNA was discovered, and this helped to reinforce Darwin's ideas as well. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a new challenge to Darwinism, though, that emerged in postmodernity. Postmodernism creates a kind of a new paradigm. There was a book that came out by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and this is really a work on the philosophy of science. But what Kuhn is trying to do is to focus on how scientific revolutions happen. And clearly Darwinism was a scientific revolution of epic proportions. And so what Kuhn does is he presents a postmodern theory of the philosophy of science. And Kuhn challenges questions whether confirmation bias prevents scientists from seriously considering any evidence that critically contradicts their views. So confirmation bias is something that continually haunts all quests for human knowledge. All human quests for knowledge are somehow or another bought into by a community of people, a system is accepted and so forth and so on, and then confirmation bias starts to set in. It is endemic to human intelligence, and it is one of our perennial faults. And scientists themselves are not immune to it. So if a rival theory and rival evidences do not fit into an entrenched paradigm, an entrenched system of thought, such as Darwinism now, then the scientists who have wholly and heavily invested their whole life into such a paradigm cannot even see the rival theory as any kind of evidence at all. They simply see it as a kind of a sham. And so this is one of the things that prevents scientific revolutions from happening. And so this is kind of a challenge to the Darwinian ideas, a challenge to a variety of fields of thought. But not everyone agrees with Thomas Kuhn. Thinkers such as Karl Popper held that Kuhn's ideas themselves were a little flaky. Popper believes, yes, that the brute facts do speak for themselves. And so Popper's philosophy of science is still a rival theory to Kuhn's ideas. Okay, so what are some of the conclusions that we can draw? Well, we've seen natural selection, just recapping here. We've seen natural selection as the final puzzle piece that Darwin discovers through reading Malthus, and then he intuits that there must be some natural process that selects the most viable and well-adapted members of a species to survive. They go on to reproduce and pass on their characteristics to their children, to their offspring. Then those offspring go through the next generation, the next cycle, and so forth and so on. And then slowly, in a uniformitarian way, they amass these changes up into another species. And so it is thought that this mechanism is sufficient to explain Darwinian thoughts. Now, you may have heard of the two terms microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is just that. It's the dragonfly's wings that are just a little bit longer that enables that dragonfly to survive. And yes, that species of dragonfly can get longer wings or change its colors, or all kinds of variations can occur. And so the idea here is that they're on a micro level, on a microcosmic level within the species, yes, it adapts and changes to its environment. The idea of macroevolution is that at some point this species crosses a boundary into becoming another species. And so here we go. We can start from a simple organism and evolve all the way up to extraordinarily complex organisms like ourselves. So some people will say, yes, Darwin, he did show us microevolution. Give credit where credit's due. You can't say you don't believe in evolution, because it's pretty apparent that there is an evolving process going on within a species. But yet then they deny the macroevolution. That is, that one species jumps up to, slowly, that is, morphs up to another species. And I would probably have sentiments in that department. I have to give credit where credit's due, and Darwin was a genius and did discover some amazing things. But the evidences for a macroevolutionary view seem to be lacking on my assessment of the evidence. But let each one examine the evidence for themselves. Is there a survival of the fittest going on? Yes. It's pretty apparent that those members of a species that have, again, the adaptation and that are the fittest, the strongest, the quickest, the smartest, whatever that might be, they're the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. Now, is there a common ancestry? This is another theme that we've seen. That's essentially the macroevolutionary thesis, that there is a common ancestry and that all creatures go back to simple organisms, even single-celled organisms. Now, there's a critical piece of the picture that seems to be missing here, and I think there's a key to this that's missing. And if this key was ever found, if this piece of the puzzle was ever found, then it would greatly advance the theory forward, but no one's found it. And that is, how does life originate? Where did life come from to begin with? So Darwinists and evolutionists today simply start with the fact that there is life and that there is a type of adaptation going on, and therefore argue that there is a common ancestry and that there is a slow movement up towards more complex forms of life due to their similarities and so forth and so on. But where did the life begin? How did it begin? And this has never been observed and has never been recreated in any type of experimental situation. And all scientific method goes back to those two things. Can you observe something, or can you recreate it in a type of experimental process? And so there's no experimental science nor observational science that life spontaneously created or spontaneously generated somewhere on planet Earth. Crick and Watson, for example, I think Crick claimed that somehow or another DNA must have been put here by some extraterrestrial source, and therefore human life did not emerge, or life itself didn't emerge here. It was put here or somehow came to be here on the planet through an extraterrestrial source. Well, that's not really an answer that makes a lot of sense. Even if that was the case, we have to ask the same question again. How did that life begin? Okay. And so that leads us back to the creation and evolution theme all over again. Was life put here by a supreme intelligence, a supreme being, and started by a supreme being and engendered with certain characteristics? Or was it spontaneously generated out of the chemicals in the environment and then then that one living cell emerges all the way down, or evolves through special selection all the way down to where we are today. So those are really the only options that we have available. Now, if you have bought into a purely atheistic view, you really have no other way to explain it. That's it. That's your only option. Okay? However, if one does believe in God, you can believe that God put life here, or you can believe a hybrid of the two, such as the biologos and the theistic evolutionary view. But if you're a full-blown philosophical naturalist, that is an atheist, you have no other way to explain the existence of life here. So now let's look at some of the implications. The implications of Darwin's ideas know no bounds, really. Natural selection was the final puzzle piece to a completely naturalistic worldview, and it's now free to flourish. And naturalism has flourished in our world. Atheistic, non-theistic, non-transcendental views of human beings have flourished in our age. Philosophical naturalism now dominates the West and our universities. And this view rigorously imposes something that we call methodological naturalism on nearly every branch and every twig in the tree of knowledge. The idea being that knowledge has to be based upon the idea that nature and the laws of nature are it. That's it. That governs everything. Okay? So that's one of the implications here. Darwinism propels that forward with great momentum. So these changes don't just shape the sciences. It's not just about biology, okay? It long since leapt outside the bounds of biology into nearly every other science, and especially the social sciences, such as sociology, psychology, and education, and economics, and all of the sub-disciplines within those, like criminal psychology, and you get the idea. There's just a bunch of sub-disciplines under each of those, okay? Nearly all of these operate now with methodological naturalism and interpret the world within the Darwinian evolutionary framework. Even the humanities themselves and the arts have fallen under this yoke as well of philosophical naturalism. So once humanity was seen as a product of nature, nature now has ontic priority over humans. So let me see if I can explain that. In other words, if you want to understand humanity or any of its vast experiences, understanding nature is the key. A major cultural shift has occurred, whereas in the year 1600, which we saw back around the time of the Renaissance, okay, in the year 1600, our culture saw the ontic order as God, man, and nature, okay, in that order. Okay, God is like the big umbrella, and under that is man, and then underneath man is nature. Now the ontic order has shifted by the time we get up to Darwin, say, 1900 or so, just 300 years. Our culture has shifted now. Nature is now the big umbrella. It now has ontic priority, okay? So it's nature, man, and then God underneath that. If you want to understand God, look in religion, just look to human beings and their societies. That explains why they believe in God. If you want to understand humanity, look to nature itself. Okay? So the ontic order of the world now versus 1600 has completely flipped.